This, gentlemen, is my profound conviction. I believe that we are at this moment sleeping on a volcano. I am profoundly convinced of it. I know not how or whence it will come, but will bring with it a most serious revolution. Be assured that that is so. These words, uttered by Alexis de Tocqueville at the National Assembly in Paris on January 29th of 1848, was a warning that was largely ignored by the Assembly. But in a few weeks, his prediction would come to pass, with almost the entirety of Europe engulfed in revolt. This revolt will see France's last king deposed, the reactionary Iron Fist of Metternich removed, the nationalistic and unification movements in Germany, Italy, and Hungary, with liberal reform and democratization attempted in almost 50 states. Here's a map of Europe right before the revolutions of 1848. The Industrial Revolution had just begun in Britain and had spread a bit to northeastern France, the Rhineland, Belgium, and some other parts of Germany, but an agricultural society was still firmly in place throughout Europe. During the original French Revolution, feudalism had been abolished in the West, but it still existed in the East. The land was still tended by either serfs or laborers on the land owned by the upper class. Industry and mechanized workshops were rare, with exceptions in major capitals, meaning that wealth was still in the land. This made nobles still firmly in the elite, with the exception of France, who had kicked out most of the nobles in the French Revolution. Population growth and prosperity were on the increase everywhere in Europe, but so was poverty, with living standards going down. There was a lack of republicanism and democracy, as after the French Revolution, republicanism was suppressed to where it only existed in some Swiss cantons and German cities. The five great powers of Great Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia dominated politics throughout the 19th century. The three great powers that will be most affected by the 1848 revolutions, France, Prussia, and Austria, each had different types of governments. France was, according to liberals at the time, a model version of government. It was centralized, unified culturally and linguistically, had one code of law and the same taxes and rates across the entire country. It was ruled by Louis Philippe under a constitutional monarchy with a legislative assembly. This legislative assembly, however, only had a voting pool of around 5% of the French population. Louis Philippe was installed after the 1830 revolution and tried to make himself out as a citizen king, but did not have much popular support, as conservatives wanted the Bourbons back and radicals wanted a complete republic. Prussia had a centralized administration but had different codes of laws and varying tax rates throughout its kingdom. It was ruled by a conservative king, Friedrich Wilhelm, without any democratic elected body. It had an astounding military considering it was the smallest of the great powers. It practiced mass conscription and wielded great influence on the German states and the German Confederation. Austria could be best described as a headache. There existed a central bureaucracy in Vienna, but every part of the empire had different rights, privileges, language, taxation, administration, and legal systems. For example, Hungary, which was part of the Austrian Empire, had its own separate administration and a feudal parliament called a Diet, which was elected by the nobility that had to consent to laws passed by the Austrians. Hungary also had their own counties with separate diets. Austria was ruled by the mentally deficient Emperor Ferdinand I, so the country is mostly ruled by Metternich and other advisors. Austria was a symbol of conservatism in Europe and wielded influence in Germany and Italy, but after the Napoleonic Wars, it was in a constant state of near bankruptcy. It got most of its taxation from the rich provinces of northern Italy, leading to hatred for the locals. The three groups that will create and oppose the 1848 revolutions are the liberals, conservatives, and radicals. Liberalism, also called constitutional monarchism, can be seen as a cautious and limited consent to the ideals of the French Revolution. Liberals wanted basic civic freedoms such as equal treatment under the law, but thought that it can only be achieved with the constitutional monarchy, as the bloody First French Republic made them wary of democracy. Liberals asserted they represented the people, but differentiated the people from the mob. To them, the people were the educated landowners, and only they deserved the vote. In France, liberalism was already implemented as part of the government, but elsewhere it was something that was to be achieved. Conservatism was created as a reaction to the French Revolution. They supported historical tradition, patriarchalism, and divine justification, all of which sharply opposed the ideas of the French Revolution. Contrary to the liberals who saw the king as getting power from the people, conservatives saw the king as getting power from God. An ideal state would be one that was run by revealed religion, not rationality. A notable conservative was Austrian Chancellor Metternich, who practically dictated conservatism across Europe after Napoleon. He attempted to impose conservatism across the continent to prevent another revolution. Conservatives often consisted of nobility, high-ranking officials, and religiously devout people. Radicalism was dominated by the French Revolution and saw Jacobin France as the model to be achieved. They waved tricolor flags calling for liberty, equality, and fraternity, making references to the guillotine. Some radicals, such as Karl Marx, advocated for a proletariat revolution. Radicalism lay in the thought of public sovereignty, as they thought that power came from all people. Because of this, they called for full male enfranchisement. Radicals tended to draw from the same category as liberals, as most of them were businessmen and property owners and relied on the support of the masses. In France, when the Bourbons were overthrown in 1830 and replaced with a constitutional monarchy, many radicals were disappointed, leading to hatred for the current regime. In the even more conservative rest of Europe, radicals were suppressed and not given any political voice. Nationalism was a major factor in the 1848 revolutions. Both liberals and radicals in Germany and Italy wanted unification, putting their hopes in Prussia and Piedmont Savoy respectively. However, both Prussia and Piedmont were ruled by conservative monarchs who would never want to rule an anyway democratic country, even if it was unified. Nationalism in France was often showed by the glorification of Napoleon. Napoleon's memory was still everywhere, as old soldiers who served under him were still alive. Even after his death, nationalists called for his heir to return to rule France, which after Napoleon II's death would be Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon attempted to seize power twice, mimicking Napoleon by calling on soldiers to rally to him. These debacles made him famous throughout France. Nationalism in Austria began to show after the French Revolution, as the many ethnic groups started reviving their native tongues and cultures. Poems, songs, and plays in native languages started showing up around this time, notably in Hungary. As Hungarian liberals attempted to impose their language on the minorities that they ruled, it made many of those minorities side with the Austrians. This is shown throughout the revolutions of 1848, as liberal groups with similar but slightly different ideas opposed one another, making their mutual defeat easier. The direct cause of the revolutions of 1848 was a mix of political and economic crisis. The bad harvests of 1845 to 1847 made grain prices high, making manufactured goods less demanded, creating a large, unemployed, angry middle class. Support for liberals and radicals had never been higher, with movements across the great powers. In France, it saw the start of the Banquet Campaign, large meetings of the radical opposition that spoke to the masses. However, the French government refused to enlarge the electorate. In Hungary, the feudal diet was won by the liberal nobles. In Italy, where there was no platform at all for liberals to gain ground, violent revolts were planned. Prussia and Austria saw liberals holding their breath to see what would happen next. The final straw was the Swiss Civil War of 1847, which saw the left win and make the cantons of Switzerland into a federal state. Metternich attempted to organize an opposition to the Swiss left, but failed, and could not afford a direct intervention to support conservatism. This showed that drastic change carried out violently was possible, and the defenders of the established order were incapable of stopping it. Paired with stubborn governments, economic recession, and popular discontent, a revolution was coming. In February of 1848, the French Banquet Campaign was ramping up. After efforts by the government to suppress banquets were attempted, they became street demonstrations. Barricades started getting built and soldiers entered Paris, but showed reluctance to shoot. Louis-Philippe, reading the room, abdicated and fled the country, with crowds invading the parliament, debating the country's future. The radicals went out with a republic proclaimed, all this happening in the span of 2 days. The victory of revolutionaries in Paris, the capital of European politics, was a signal for events almost everywhere. A Sicilian revolt which had happened earlier in January managed to push to Naples, making the conservative kingdom of the two Sicilies into a liberal constitutional monarchy. In Munich, Vienna, Budapest, Venice, Krakow, Milan, and many other cities, barricades started getting built. The conflicts were all brief, with political change following immediately. Prussia and Bavaria saw conservative ministers replaced with liberals. The symbol of conservatism in Europe, Metternich, fled to London, with liberals replacing him. Venice and Milan proclaimed their independence, expressing their desire to become part of a unified Italy. Hungary's liberal diet declared independence, with Krakow following, with the creation of an independent Polish state. In Germany, the German states accepted liberal demands of a pan-German parliament to debate the constitution for a unified Germany, called the Frankfurt Parliament. In Italy, Piedmont Sardinia declared war on Austria, annexing Parma and Modena and merging with Lombardy and Venetia, uniting northern Italy. Throughout Europe, it seemed like the liberals were triumphant. However, the conservative forces were not defeated. They were just shocked by the rapid success. Soon they would regroup and change the course of the revolution. With the exception of France, a common trend across all the revolutions was that they were liberal, not radical in nature. Although conservative ministers were replaced, republics were never proclaimed, and the kings and emperors remained. The revolutions in Germany called for a unified Germany under the Prussian king. The Hungarians who proclaimed independence still recognized the Habsburg monarchy, and the new Italian independent republics decided to merge with the Kingdom of Piedmont, exchanging republicanism for a chance of a united Italy. The barricade fights were all extremely short, with conservative forces surrendering without much of a fight. It is likely that if the rulers held their nerve and committed troops to the rebellions, most, if not all, of the revolutions would be suppressed immediately. This is shown in Austria, as the revolution was crushed after conservative forces rallied with the new Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. Italy and Hungary met similar fates as the invading forces of Piedmont were defeated, and the independent Hungary was dissolved, with help from the Russians. Another reason for the revolution's failure was disagreement on the left. Liberals and radicals argued about minor topics and constitutions, while conservative groups grew more powerful. In Germany, the Frankfurt Parliament was unable to present a united front, as representatives argued about useless details while conservatives gathered strength. When Friedrich Wilhelm refused to recognize the parliament, there was no united front on the left that could oppose him. In the other two great powers, Great Britain and Russia, attempts at uprisings would occur, but did not succeed due to the opposite reasons. Britain was already very liberal, and attempted reform did not have much popular support. Russia was so conservative that attempts at uprisings were noticed immediately and squashed. Although the 1848 revolutions failed, the consequences would affect Europe for the next century. France, under its new republic, implemented full manhood suffrage, but instead of resulting in a radical parliament, Louis Napoleon was elected by a landslide. The infamous name of Napoleon, as well as being seen as the least bad candidate by the remaining conservatives, earned him 74% of the popular vote. In 3 years, Louis Napoleon would follow in his uncle's footsteps and overthrow the Republic in a coup, creating the Second French Empire. In the rest of Europe, although the revolutions were brutally crushed, their legacies of them lived on. The Frankfurt Parliament sat with the impression that a future united Germany would be dominated by Prussia and exclude Austria. Austria's act of inviting Russia to crush the Hungarian Revolution would have disastrous consequences, as when Austria refused to help Russia in the Crimean War, a rivalry between the two empires started, eventually contributing to the start of the First World War. The failure of Piedmont resulted in the abdication of its king, resulting in Victor Emmanuel II ascending the throne, who in a couple of decades would unify Italy and become its first king. In short, the revolutions of 1848 at first glance was a failed revolution, whose changes would be erased quickly. But it set up the future unification of Italy and Germany and created the foundations of the conflicts and events of the 19th century. Liberalism, socialism, and nationalism spread across Europe, and the Communist Manifesto, which was written during the revolutions, would create the rise of Lenin and the USSR, changing Europe and the world forever.